Hey doing everyone, welcome back. You know, I did a video the other day where I was actually the one where I brought up a second civil war and whether or not that is imminent. In fact, I'm going to link to that video in case you haven't seen it. I'll put a link in the description below. But if you have seen that video, I mean, maybe you've read through the comments, and if not, that's all right. But one of the comments, right, was how I compared today's Republicans to the Confederacy. And a response to that was that, this person responded that they were not the rebels back then because the Republicans were founded as an anti-slavery party, which is true. That is absolutely true. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. The party started in, I want to say it was 1854. It was definitely some point in the 1850s. I want to say it was 54. And Lincoln was the first Republican president. And there was a long line of Republican presidents after Lincoln. After Johnson, actually, starting with Grant. But if you're going to make the argument that today's Republicans are the same as the Republicans of the 1860s, I'm going to ask you what the hell you're even smoking. Today's Republicans are not the same party as the 1960s. There was indeed a party shift, and I know Republicans like to deny that because they want to say that they are not the racist, the Democrats are the racist. The Democrats created the KKK, and the Democrats created Jim Crow, and the Democrats wanted to keep slaves. Well, first of all, slavery was not a partisan issue. It was a North-South issue for the most part. There were a few exceptions. Delaware and Maryland, for example, in the North allowed slavery. But yeah, there were exceptions. But it wasn't. Slavery was not a partisan thing. The Civil War was not a partisan thing necessarily. It was, it was a North-South thing. The KKK, originally not a partisan thing. It did become a thing for the Democrats, which had later shifted to become a more Republican thing. But even then, it's not cleanly along party lines. I mean, let's take a look at the late Senator Robert Byrd, who was a Democrat, and he was, I don't know what his rank was within the KKK, but he was a high-ranking KKK official. And then we have former Grand Wizard David Duke, who is a Republican. So, and then you get, guys like Steve Scalise, who calls himself David Duke without the baggage. Not something that I would run on, not something that I would say. Well, first of all, I have nothing to do with David Duke anyway, but even if I did have some similarities with him, I still wouldn't compare myself to him. And then when you want to say that Jim Crow laws were a Democrat thing, yeah, that's true. That's true. The Democrats were the party that were prominent in the South. You know, I mean, if you want to look at some old election maps, the South was completely blue. South was completely blue. And then it started to shift, and it became red. Now, if there was no party shift, how did that happen? How did the South become red while some of the traditionally red northern states become blue? Right? Well, let's take a look at it, shall we? Let's take a look. First of all, to deny that the party shift ever happened, you have to assume that all the liberals became conservative and all the conservatives became liberal and just kept the party name. Right? You have to assume either that happened, or something that is also not very likely to have happened is all of those Republicans from up north moved to the South while all of the Democrats from the South moved to the North. And that didn't happen. We know that didn't happen. I mean, also, if the shift never happened, and if the Democrats were always the bad guys, right, which I'm saying, yes, the Democrats were the bad guys at that time. But if the Democrats were the bad guys, I have a question for today's Republicans. Why are you so fond of the symbols of traitorous Democrats? Why are you so fond of those? Why are you so fond of that yeehaw flag? You know, the one that is associated with the traitorous, treasonous Democrats. Why are you so fond of that flag? Why is it that you want traitorous, treasonous Democrats honored with statues? And don't tell me it's about history, because when those statues went up, there was no historical value. It was right around the time that the civil rights movement was starting to take off. And it was a signal that y'all better stay in your place. Remember where you belong. That's what it was a signal to. Okay? So why are you defending statues? Also, if you want to tell me that it's about history, go to Germany. Germans know their history. You will not find a single statue of Adolf Hitler in Germany. Maybe in some museums or whatever, but you're not going to find them out in public. You know why? Because you don't honor the bad guys. You just don't do it. You don't honor the bad guys. So, the party switch. What exactly happened? Well, First of all, today's Republicans are wrong when they say it never happened. Today's Democrats are also wrong when they try to pinpoint it to the 1960s. Now, the 1960s, yes, that was where a lot of it did happen. But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just, Civil Rights Act, and then Strom Thurmond becomes a Republican, which causes the shift. No, it didn't happen that easily. Did not happen that easily. It started in the 1930s, roughly, with, FDR was elected in 1932. His economic policies were helpful to black Americans. Therefore, black voters gravitated toward FDR in large numbers. Okay, so that's part of it, right? Because, up until then, black voters had largely been Republicans because of the whole civil rights movement. It was Republicans who were in favor and Democrats who were opposed at the time. Of course, now we have Republicans who say that, the Civil Rights Act and the whole civil rights movement was a mistake. Martin Luther King was a bad guy, and, we should have never passed the Civil Rights Act and things like that, right? Some Republicans are out there actually saying that. Most notably, Charlie Kirk, by the way. And we're not supposed to quote Charlie Kirk. We're not supposed to tell you anything that he said, but, his death doesn't make the fact that he said that go away. So, starting in about the 1930s is when the shift, that was kind of the beginning of the shift right there, right? And then we come up to the 1940s and things are very slowly starting to change. Even things like, Jackie Robinson being allowed to play Major League Baseball, right? Which is a lot more political than you might think. Don't get me wrong, he absolutely deserved that spot on that team. And I don't think politics had anything to do with him playing for the Dodgers. But it was part of a larger movement. It was symbolic of the larger movement that was happening. Right? 1948, and I don't have any evidence to back this up. This is just kind of, there may be evidence to back this up. I did not find it. I also didn't look for it. But you remember that picture of Harry Truman holding up a Chicago Tribune headline that says Dewey defeats Truman in the election of 1948? Yeah. I remember that headline. Well, I don't remember it, of course, but I remember seeing pictures of it for most of my life. Well, all of my life, really, because, my mother was an infant when that happened, so, so anyway, Dewey defeats Truman. And I believe part of the reason that headline was written is because Democrats, still largely a Southern racist party for the most part. In fact, there was a split within the Democrats beginning at the convention when there was very specific pro-civil rights language in their party platform, which caused the Dixiecrats to sever, and Strom Thurmond became the Dixiecrat candidate for president. So you have the Democrats, the Dixiecrats, and the Republicans. So I think that combined with Truman desegregating the military led to that headline, despite that headline being inaccurate. I mean, all the polls had Truman, had Truman losing. They had Dewey winning that election. And as you know, Dewey was never president of the United States. There's never been a President Thomas Dewey. So, I believe that, the split within the Democrats led to that headline and the polling. But the Democrats didn't split enough in order to deny Dewey the presidency. Now, in the 1950s roll around, now you have Eisenhower's president, and he's sending the National Guard in to enforce desegregation, court decisions, and laws. Brown versus Board of Education ruled that separate is not equal. Separate but equal, when it comes to education. And the ruling was, no, that doesn't exist. There's no separate but equal. It's either separate or it's equal, and it needs to be equal. So, that kind of got people to dig in their heels a little bit more. But keep in mind, attitudes are still shifting. What else happened in the 1950s? Rock and roll came about. Rock and roll music. How does that play in? Well, it was this black music, despite the fact that music really has no color, or shouldn't anyway. This black music was driving all these white kids crazy, right? And of course, it was all unacceptable until you got this good-looking white kid out of Mississippi by the name of Elvis Presley, putting a white face onto this black music to make it a little bit more palatable for white parents to accept that their kids were listening to it. So that kind of started more of a cultural shift than it was a political shift. But then, you get the 60s roll around, and the Democrats in the South are still largely racist, still largely segregationist, but the Northern Democrats start having a different attitude. Most specifically, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. He was Attorney General under his brother, John F. Kennedy. Now, John was indifferent toward the civil rights movement at first, and Bobby kind of pushed him in that direction and nudged him to go in that direction. Right? So, John Kennedy starts embracing civil rights as a Democrat. He met with Martin Luther King. Well, Obviously, you know what happened to John Kennedy. It had nothing to do with his take on civil rights, of course, but you know what happened. You know what happened to him. And Lyndon Johnson becomes president. Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Texas. A Southern Democrat from Texas expends a lot of political capital to sign into law the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I mean, that was a dangerous move for him in the South, right? Very risky. And after the Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater, the Republican, who had voted against it. Now, if you want to say that the Goldwater was not a racist, there's evidence to support that. There is evidence to support that Goldwater was not racist. He voted against it based on constitutional grounds, on which I think he was incorrect. But I don't think Goldwater was an actual racist. However, he voted against the Civil Rights Act, and he won in the Deep South. A Republican won in the Deep South, which, that didn't happen, right? That just didn't happen. That was unheard of. Now, obviously, Johnson won in a landslide. But Lee Atwater, a Republican strategist, he sees this, right? And he develops what is now known as the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy was for the Republicans to court the disaffected white racist vote in the South. You know, well, we don't want those people to be equal to us. So they started using coded languages, dog whistles, if you will. You know, in fact, Atwater actually said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing here, you can't say N-word, you know what it is, but you can talk about busing and you can talk about states' rights. You know, because we're told that the Civil War was all about states' rights. But states' rights to do what exactly? Oh yeah, to own human beings as property. Right, got it. So, anyway, throughout the 70s, that, you know, Nixon in 68 and then later in 72, with, at that point in time, the largest landslide victory ever, losing only Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. You know, Nixon comes into office. Right? Now, obviously, he's forced out, and Carter beats Ford in 1976. And, you know, in both Carter's elections, he does pretty well in the South, but not as well as previous Democrats had done. So, you know, Reagan comes in, he wins in a landslide in 1980, and then an even bigger landslide than what Nixon had in 1984, right? Losing only Minnesota and Washington, D.C. George H.W. Bush, his 1988 campaign infamously had the Willie Horton ad. Was it intended to be racist? I don't know. all right? But it was definitely perceived that way, because you've got this scary black man who is out of prison and, commits a crime while he's out of prison. I want to say he killed somebody while he was out of prison. I would have to look that up. If you know, let me know in the comments. But I want to say that's what happened. Or maybe he raped a woman. I don't know. Willie Horton, obviously not a good guy, but also used to scare white voters, right? And, add that to Dukakis and his silly tank ad, Dukakis just came across as very weak. Plus, it didn't help that, he tried to paint a World War II hero as a wimp. That really didn't work very well. Well, the shift is still going on, right? Because you still have conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And that continues into the 90s. And the shift is still not really complete, but it's almost there at this point. Clinton comes in, and he's more of a moderate Democrat. So he does well in the South, and it doesn't hurt that, some of his campaign buttons and whatnot use the Yeehaw flag. And, he had another Southerner as his running mate, and they called themselves the Sons of the New South or something like that. Two young Southern guys. And they win in 92 and 96. But then, if you look at that 2000 map, right, because in 92 and 96, the South there's a lot of blue in there, but there's also quite a bit of red in there, right? And more Republicans are winning at the congressional level, right? They're winning in the House and in the Senate. And they have a lot of the governorships. But then you look at the 2000 election, Al Gore didn't even win his home state of Tennessee, right? A state where he probably should have done well, but he didn't. And since then, the South has been reliably red. Reliably red. The only exceptions have been North Carolina has gone for Obama at least once, if not twice. Florida, which is kind of its own thing. It's not, the saying in Florida, the farther south you go, the more north you are, or something like that. That's been kind of an anomaly where, Florida's just kind of an anomaly. It's a red state that has, used to be actually a purple state, went for Obama twice, went for Trump 3 times, went for Bush twice. I want to say it went for Clinton both times, not 100% sure on that, but the South is reliably red. But again, North Carolina at least once went for Obama, and Georgia in 2020 went for Biden. Other than that, the South has been reliably red. So if there is no party switch, if there was no evolution of the parties, or de-evolution on one side, how did that happen? How did that happen? Are you telling me that the old liberals just became conservative? That the South has been liberal all this time and then they just decided to become conservative? Or are you telling me that all those up north liberals came down south? Or all those up north conservatives, excuse me, those conservative Republicans from up north came to the South? Or did the parties shift? You tell me. I mean, the evidence, I think it's clear. I'll see you next time.